Welcome to lecture number 125 on the Moreh Nevuchim on Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. Again, for those that just join us online and watch, that we are studying now, when I say page numbers, I'm referring to the Shlomo Pinas edition, this edition, volume 2. We are currently up to page 561. That's 561. And we are about to read the paragraph that says, "There is also wisdom." Um, this chapter is a pretty long one, not the most exciting, but we'll certainly find things in here of interest. And I'll kind of run through this a little quicker than usual, but if you want to slow me down, then just slow me down. But we're the chapter 41, he's discussing the sixth class. Remember, Rambam divided in order to help us, to help him describe in a organized way the reasons for the commandments, the logic behind the Torah. He divided into 14 groups. The sixth group refers to the punishments, the logic behind the severities of the different punishments that the Torah prescribes for various transgressions. So he laid down a rule which we ended last week. He talked about the four basic types of punishments, and we're not talking about monetary issues that we discussed at other places. We were talking about punishments that a court gives. One was death by order of court, which was the highest. The second one was karet, meaning being cut off, which is a spiritual punishment done by God, but it also entails lashes. The second one was just lashes, not being cut off, and the third one was prohibitions that don't entail any of those four. They're just prohibitions, but they don't have any court administered punishment. And he mentioned that things that there's higher temptations for, things that there's that are more severe, they entail more severe punishments. Things that are less severe, less punishments. He gave us those rules last time. So he mentions here, there's a lot to be said in general about the subject of the punishments that are prescribed by the Torah, and how the rabbis kind of mitigated the times the times that punishments were actually meted out, and given all the conditions that need to be fulfilled in order to give any of these punishments, to administer them, whether they be lashes or, especially in the case of capital punishment. But that's not really the subject of this Rambam here. The subject here is what's officially the prescribed punishment. So he mentions there is also wisdom in the number of the strokes. In other words, one of those punishments that given are makot, strokes, lashes, right? But there's not only wisdom in when we decide that, when the Torah tells us that that's the correct punishment, but even in how it's done. For it is determinate with regard to the maximum and indeterminate with regard to the minimum. With regard to the individuals, I'm sorry. For an individual may receive only such flogging as he can bear, but the maximum number of strokes is 40, even if he can bear 100. According to the Torah, right, you don't give someone lashes if they cannot handle it. So there's a maximum. Even if a person is really big, tough, and strong, and he can handle more, he doesn't get more. But if a person is weak or ill or whatever, for whatever reason, then he would get less. So there's wisdom in that. So the Rambam is just showing us the wisdom in that. The next, you will find there is no obligation for a sentence of death to be pronounced by a court of law with reference to prohibited foods. There is no place where one gets a death penalty for eating something that he is not supposed to eat. For in this there is no great harm. There's nothing terrible really happens if a person goes and eats a ham sandwich. Zohar says not to do it, and you shouldn't do it, but the world doesn't come to an end if you decide to have a cheeseburger and you're not supposed to, right? And people are not strongly attracted to them as they are by the pleasure of sexual intercourse, of other things, where there's more desire for them. I don't know if somebody really, really likes a pepperoni pizza, maybe they might argue and say that there is, but the Rambam is saying here that there isn't. The penalty of being cut off is entailed by the eating of certain foods. However, the next level penalty, the karet, in certain cases, that heavy punishment is prescribed. Blood, for instance, and that for they had a great desire at that time to eat of it because of a certain type of kind of idolatrous cult, as is explained in the book of Tumtum, which he's quoted before. That was one of those books that describes the practices of idolatry. Since idolatry is involved and people are drawn towards idolatry, therefore that penalty is prescribed for that, and that's the logic behind that. Remember, Rambam is in everything we're going to study in the rest of this chapter. He's trying to show that there's logic and reason behind these prescriptions, these punishments. Much stress is therefore laid upon this. That's why they have the penalty. The penalty of being cut off is also entailed by the eating of fat. The fatty parts of an animal. Everybody loves a juicy piece of steak, right? So because people take pleasure in it, people like that really moist, juicy, fatty piece of meat. So people have a desire for it. Therefore, there's a heavier punishment. It is especially used for sacrifice in order to glorify it, as shall be explained. There's also another reason, because those fatty parts of the animal are generally reserved for the altar when they're brought on sacrifice as sacrifices, or for the priestly portions. And the Torah wants to emphasize the sacredness of that, and therefore it levies a heavy punishment on someone who eats it. Similarly, the penalty of being cut off is entailed by partaking of chametz on Pesach, leavened bread on Pesach, and a food on the day of fasting, meaning on Yom Kippur, eating on Yom Kippur. There's also karet. Why is that? Because of the hardship imposed by this kind of abstention, and because of the belief to which these actions lead, right? It's difficult to stay away from chametz on Pesach, right? And it's also difficult to fast on Yom Kippur. And therefore, in order to kind of force us, encourage us to do it, the punishment is heavier. And also because there's such important ideas attached to both of those transgressions. The chametz on Pesach and fasting on Yom Kippur have such important concepts that are basics to the religion. For these are actions that fortify opinions that are foundations of the Torah. I mean, the exodus of Egypt and its miracles is related to Pesach, which is such a fundamental part of our religion, and the belief in repentance. The idea of tshuva, our ability to repent, is what Yom Kippur represents, and fasting on Yom Kippur is part of what's supposed to encourage us to repent. So by not keeping those laws, the punishments are more severe. For on this day shall atonement be made, and so on. The penalty of being cut off is also entailed by eating the remainder of a sacrifice. That's nosar, what you leave over, again, or a profane sacrifice, or something holy while was one unclean, just as it is entailed by the eating of fat, similar to what we just said by fat, because this is something that relates to the holiness and specialness and sanctity of the sacrifices. The purpose being the glorification of the sacrifice will be explained later on. We're going to go into it later. Rambam says the rules that are in a different chapter. He's going to discuss the rules that relate to bringing of sacrifices and why we treat them with certain holiness, because we want to create an atmosphere of sanctity around them. As for death by order of a court of law, I just turned to page 562. I'm at the top of the page now. You will find that this sentence is only brought on in grave cases. The chiyuv of the incurring the sentence of death is only in very serious cases, either in the case of the corruption of belief or in that of a very great crime. Either it's very great, severe transgression in the sense that it truly contradicts the foundations of our belief system, of our faith, or because it's just a severe crime. I refer to idolatry, adulterous or incestuous sexual intercourse, and the shedding of blood, and all that leads to these crimes, as well in the cases of profanation of the Sabbath, as the latter fortifies the belief in creation of the world, of a false claim of prophecy, someone who claims to be a prophet and isn't, of a rebellious elder, which we're going to talk about a little more in detail later, because of the great harm that results in these cases, of a person that strikes his father or his mother or curses them, because of the great impudence of the thing, and it is destroying the good order of the household, which is the first part of the city. It's so important to maintain the structure, the integral structure of a family. As for a stubborn and rebellious son, he must be put to death because of what he will become, for necessarily he will murder later on. That's something that he's going to do. Each and every one of these subjects can be discussed at length, but Rambam is just listing things for which the sentence of death is incurred and showing how serious they are. He that steals a man, a person that kidnaps, must likewise be punished in this manner, for he exposes him to death, because he puts that person at risk of death. Also, he that comes breaking in, a person that sneaks in to steal something, for he too is prepared to kill. When a person sneaks into someone's house, he realizes that the owner will defend himself or herself with their life, and therefore he comes prepared to kill the owner of the house should that happen. These three, a stubborn, rebellious son, someone who steals a human being and sells him, and someone that breaks into a house will become shedders of blood. Necessarily, a person who engages in human trafficking will eventually end up killing someone, even though they didn't kill them yet. But it's a business which, if you can even call it that, but it's an occupation which inevitably leads to murder. In the same way that breaking into people's homes inevitably leads to murder, in the same way the stubborn and rebellious son inevitably leads to murder. You will not find that death by order of a court of law is prescribed except in the case of these great crimes. Those are the only times you have it. And he mentioned sexual transgressions. Not all incestuous and adulterous sexual intercourse is punished by death by order of a court of law. Only such as is easy to engage in, or is most shameful, or has the strongest attraction. The only things that are listed are the kinds of things which require a heavy punishment because they're easy for people to transgress, or they have the strongest attraction. That which is not of this kind is merely punished by cutting off. Other types of adulterous relationships are only punished by karet. Nor are all species of idolatry punished by death by order of a court of law. Only the fundamental ones, such as calling the people to worship idols, prophesying in their name, and making children pass through fire, consulting spirits, and being a wizard or a sorcerer, things like that. Fine. It is clear. Like I said, I know that each and every one of these subjects are things that we can really sit on and dwell on. The Rambam is just kind of saying, the point being that these are very severe sins, so the punishments fit the crime, and therefore it makes sense. The Torah makes sense, which is the bottom line of this entire section that we're studying now. It is clear that as there must be punishments, it is indispensable to have judges distributed in every town. If we have to mete out punishments, there must be judges, right? There must be, which is another mitzvah in the Torah related to this. You have to have a system of courts. There must be testimony of witnesses, which is another mitzvah in the Torah, that we have a system of witnesses saying testimony. And a ruler who is feared and held in awe. The government needs to be feared in the sense that when the government says something, they have to have some teeth. They have to have ability to enforce their rules. And who uses all sorts of deterrence and fortifies the authority of the judges, and in his turn draws strength from them. Thus, the reason for all the commandments that we have enumerated in the book of Judges has been explained. So everything that I said about setting up courts, making sure the courts have a system by which they can enforce their rulings, making sure that the government has systems by which they can enforce their laws, and making sure that in their laws, the punishments fit the crime and act as deterrents, and so on and so forth, all of that is logical. It behooves us now, in conformity with the purpose of this treatise. Now that I laid out all these things, I'm going to focus a little bit because I want to be consistent with the purpose of me writing this book, to focus on something which might not seem to make so much sense. Okay, just like, remember, he did at the end of last chapter with the broken back of the heifer. So he mentioned this, that. But then he zeroed in on something which is a little bit harder to understand. So let me just give you a little background. What is a rebellious elder? Rebellious elder is when the high court, or in the days of the temple, there was a Sanhedrin, the high court, which sat in a chamber in the temple compound, and they were the highest court to which lower courts would appeal when they had difficult cases, and they were the authorities to determine how to fulfill the Torah's mandates and dictates in whatever issue came before them. So, and the Torah tells us that we have to listen to the high court. That's the Sanhedrin. But let's say there is a person who comes and says that I think I have a different way of understanding the Torah's commandment. right? So first he can discuss it, he can say and whatever, but then if they rule against him, right, then he's required to accept the ruling of the court, right? So and if he refuses to accept it, and then he acts upon his and teaches others to act upon his ruling, which is in contrast to the opposite ruling that was given by the Supreme Court, he is to be put to death. So I shall say, inasmuch as, so why is that? Why is that so important, right? All he did is have another opinion, right? What's the big deal, right? Every court has a dissenting opinion, right? So the reason why this is so important, I shall say, inasmuch as God may be exalted knew that the commandments of this law, and this is a very interesting piece here. So listen carefully to what he says. And I'm going on the bottom of 562 and the top of 563. God knew that the commandments of the Torah will need in every time and place, as far as some of them are concerned, to be added to or subtracted from, according to the diversity of places, happenings, and conjunctures of circumstances. God knew that there would be necessary changes. Now, what does he mean by this is the subject of a huge amount of debate. But let's just take Rambam's words at face value just for the moment, just to at least read what he's saying, right? There will need to be subtractions and additions as time goes on, because circumstances of history will change. However, how did God handle this? A, he forbade adding to them or subtracting from them, saying, thou shalt not add thereto nor diminish from it. In other words, you cannot say this this commandment doesn't exist anymore, or this prohibition doesn't exist anymore. So you can't take it out of the Torah, erase it, and amend it out of the Constitution for what you will. It's there. The mitzvah is there, right? Because what would happen if you could do that? For this might have led to the corruption of the rules of law and to the belief that the latter did not come from God, right? If once we do that, then we're going to say, well, if someone says, well, God commanded us that mitzvah and you just took it out, are you trying to say that God didn't command it? And then people will go around saying maybe God didn't say it, but that would undermine the foundation of the Torah. So, however, right? So withal, he permitted the men of knowledge of every period, I refer to the great court of law, that's what we call usually the Sanhedrin, to take precautions with the view to consolidating the ordinances of the law by means of regulations in which they innovate with the view to repairing fissures, and to perpetuate these precautionary measures according to what has been said by the sages, build a hedge for the Torah. But because there are going to be historical circumstances and things will change, needs will change, people will change, society will change, et cetera, needs will arise, and so on, they're going to have to be able to enact regulations that act as a hedge to the Torah, right? Similarly, so in other words, and those typically, a hedge to the Torah means a regulation which protects the integrity of the Torah law, which wasn't necessarily given by the Torah, but because of the needs of the time, they have to make those rules. But there's the flip side too. Similarly, they were permitted in certain circumstances or with a view to certain events to abolish certain actions prescribed by the law, right? There are certain circumstances where the Sanhedrin, the high court, is allowed to abolish certain things that the Torah says we're supposed to do, right? Think of the most simple examples are, we don't shake a lulav on Shabbat, right? When Sukkot is Shabbat, we don't bring the lulav to the synagogue, because even though the Torah says we're supposed to do it for 7 days, for the reasons they felt were necessary, they enacted that we should not, right? Or not blowing a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, or examples like that are some of the more famous examples, right? So they told us things that are prescribed by the Torah, they were able to enact rules and say, no, in certain circumstances or for this time period, you don't do it, right? Or to permit some of the things forbidden by it. There are some cases where they're allowed to even allow people to do things that they're not supposed to do. But these measures may not be perpetuated, but they can't be permanent rulings. In other words, they cannot say you no longer need to keep this mitzvah. In other words, we're going to subtract this from the Torah. The Torah said you have to shake a lulav. We're abolishing the whole thing about taking a lulav on Sukkot, right? They can't do that, but they can say that these circumstances in this particular time and place, one need not do, or one should need not or should not do it for whatever reason they have to make that enactment, right? So as we have explained in the introduction to the commentary in the Mishnah, and speaking of temporary decision, usually that's known as horat shah. That's what the as a decree for a particular time period. The through this kind of governance, the law remains one. So the Torah remains one Torah. We haven't changed the essence of the Torah, right? And one is governed in every time and with a view to every happening in accordance with that happening, right? So number one, we allow the Torah to remain intact. We maintain the integrity of the Torah, while at the same time we allow circumstances to be dealt with, right, in the way that they need to be dealt with. I'm in the middle of the paragraph, but I want to just make one observation. Because this is only allowed by a Sanhedrin, right? By a Sanhedrin in the high court, which doesn't necessarily, and this is, I know it's a broad statement. Sanhedrin existed in the time of the temple, but it also existed after the temple for a couple hundred years, right? It does not exist anymore, right? And I think I mentioned Rabbi Shmuel Phillips' book. What does he call it? Book. I'll remember soon what he calls it. But where he shows how basically the concept of Sanhedrin kind of ended with the Chasimat Talmud, with the end of the period of the writing of the Talmud, right? And since then, there is no such body within Judaism to make these enactments, right, and make such decrees, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the need to do so is gone. So Judaism has been stuck in a bind for what is now about 1,800 years, right? It would be, I think if someone were to claim that the circumstances haven't required revisiting these issues, the person would be just plain simply stupid or ignorant, right? Or blind. And I don't mean physically blind, I mean just completely blind to evidence. I think we all know how dramatically the world has changed. And to have a Sanhedrin who can have the authority to make such pronouncements would be wonderful, but we don't have it. So we're really stuck. It's a difficult situation, because who knows what kind of enactments would have, could have, or should have been made in the last 1,800 years that we do not have a body to make them. And Yosef, go ahead. I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that today I listened to a class of the rabbi of Young Israel of Woodmere, and he talked about how the chief rabbinate of Israel used to be different, and I'm pretty sure I know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But the fact is that they did make some decisions that were applicable for our time, as opposed to like Heter Mechira of on Shemitah. And the fact that the majority of the Jewish people didn't accept that doesn't mean anything, really, because they did it with that kind of authority, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it would be wonderful if there was a body, and if the chief rabbinate of Israel could, in theory at least, be such a body. I don't think today anyone would for a whole host of reasons which are way beyond the scope of this podcast.
Yeah, that's why I'm complaining,
yeah,
because on the one hand we do have it, on the other hand nobody accepts their authority anymore. So
yeah. So exactly how to establish a Sanhedrin nowadays, I mean, I mean, based on the nature of the fractious nature of the Jewish people, from all the way to the left, to the right, to the top, to the bottom, to the up, to the down, to the diaspora, to the people in Israel, to everything, the chance of putting together such a body of rabbis that would command the respect of the Jewish people, I think is approximately the same as me winning the lotto tomorrow, maybe less. But in theory, the way the Torah was designed, the way Rambam is describing how the Torah is supposed to work, is that's the system that God, so to speak, put in place, right? He put in place a Torah which is to remain intact, and the Sanhedrin, and a mechanism with which we can deal with individual, circumstances that changes throughout history. And so that's how it's supposed to work. But unfortunately, it's not how it works today. So we wish it would, and little glimmers of hope, like you mentioned before, a little glimmer of maybe establishing a chief rabbinate that could do it, but then you end up with a chief rabbinate that's not respected for obvious reasons for anyone that reads the newspaper, right? So it's just really tough. It's really tough. Anyway, so through this kind of governance, the law, I just read that. If, however, that's where I'm up to, near the end, about 10 lines before the end of the first paragraph on 563. So now let's get back to the subject at hand, which is the rebellious elder, right? The Zaken Mamre is how he's called in the Gemara, right? If, however, every man of knowledge had been permitted to engage in this speculation concerning particulars, let's say every single rabbi had the authority, right, to think, well, and he may have, or she may have, a very good explanation or reasoning behind the rule that they want to make or abolish, or practice that they want to do or not do. There may be really nicely reasoned and everything, but if everybody could do it, it would become, the people would have perished because of the multiplicity of the differences of opinion and the subdivisions of doctrines. There would be forget 3 major streams of Judaism in America. There would be 755,000 streams of Judaism, and everybody who has who can open a book and read Hebrew in his living room is going to make declarations, and the whole thing will be ridiculous, right? So consequently, he may be exalted, has forbidden all the men of knowledge, with the single exception of the great court of law, to undertake this. That's why the Torah set the system in place where only the Sanhedrin has the authority to do that, and has those who disagree with this court killed. Now, remind you, he doesn't mean disagree. If you learn the laws of Zaken Mamre, the fact of his disagreement is not the issue. It's the fact that he engages, he takes his disagreement, teaches it, and acts upon it, and teaches people to act upon it. You're allowed to disagree with them. You're just not allowed, but you're not allowed to make it into practical law and practice because of the reason that Rambam just explained. So that's why such a severe penalty is important. And for the purpose of this chapter, that's why, for if it could be opposed by everyone who engages in speculation, the intended purpose would be annulled and the usefulness of these regulations abolished. The whole thing would fall apart. Okay, so that takes care of the issue of the Zaken Mamre and the reasoning behind that. Know that with regard to the perpetration of things forbidden by the law, there are 4 categories. So now he's going to go into the type of transgression in the sense of the intent on the part of the person doing them, right? We all know that murder is divided into first degree, second degree, manslaughter. I don't personally know, right? If somebody sits down and plots the murder of his neighbor, and he goes and he buys a gun, and then he finds out when his neighbor's going to be in the front yard, and he goes in the front yard and he shoots him in the head, that's one kind of murder, right? Another guy who gets into a fight, and they're screaming and yelling and punching each other, and he gives one punch too hard and he kills him, that's bad, right? And deserves to be punished, but it's not quite as bad as the other guy, right? And then another guy. So we have these categories within the secular law. A person who's driving down the street and he runs through a red light and he hits someone and kills them. That's terrible, tragic, and the person should get seriously punished. But obviously, it's not as bad as either of the first 2 guys, right? So in the halacha, there are the following 4 categories. The first being that of the compelled transgressor. In other words, the person who is in total onus, he's forced to do it, right? So he had absolutely no choice in the matter. There was not, it's what's called an ones in halachic terminology. The second is an inadvertent transgressor, which is a shogeg, right? In other words, he didn't realize that he was doing something wrong, but he did something wrong. The third is that of a deliberate transgressor, right? It's a person who deliberately decides to do something that's wrong. And the fourth is him who transgresses in a high-handed manner, a person who obstinately, publicly goes and does something wrong. So as for the compelled transgressor, it is stated textually that he should not be punished, and no sin whatever lies upon him, for he may be exalted, said, but unto the damsel, this is talking about a victim of rape, right? You don't punish her at all. There's no sin worthy that she didn't do anything. She was raped against her will, and you don't punish her for whatever crime of adultery was involved. It was completely against her will. It was forced upon her.
Yes.
You leave her alone, right? That's an ones, right? And that's the classic ones is God forbid, the victim of rape. Um, then 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 the second category, as for the inadvertent transgressor, a person who does something bishogeg, he does something inadvertently, it is a sin, he sins. For if he had made efforts to be firm and cautious, there would have been no inadvertence on his part. A shogeg, he didn't intend to sin, he didn't want to do something wrong, he didn't really want to hurt anybody, but the example in the Torah is the person who's chopping wood in the forest, and a piece of wood or the axe, flies out of his hand and kills someone inadvertently. That's the classic shogeg. So all the guy went to do was chop wood. He wanted to eat his house or cook dinner or whatever. But in the end, he killed somebody. But he's not to be punished, though he does need atonement, right? So hence he must bring a sacrifice, right? I just turned the page to page 564. All right. And the reason being, Rambam is going to explain in a minute, because he should have been careful. He should have held on tighter to the axe. He should have made sure that there's nobody standing around. He should have made sure that you're chopping the wood in such a way that a piece wouldn't fly and hit somebody. So you're responsible for what you do, but you still have to be careful. In this case, however, when it comes to something inadvertent, the Torah distinguishes between a private individual, a king, and a high priest, and a man qualified to give decisions on the points of law. So from this we learn why is that different? Because depending on what's expected of you, the knowledge that's expected of you, right? We expect you to act in a more responsible manner, right? You can't claim I didn't know that this and this might be the result, or I might be doing this, or that this was wrong, if you're the kind of person that really should have known, right? So you might hold someone more responsible if they're a company that cuts wood, then we expect them to take precautions to make sure they don't hurt people when they do their job, right? So and so on. From this, we learn that everyone who accomplishes an action or gives a decision on a point of law in accordance with the doctrine established by his own efforts belongs, if he is not the great court of law of the high priest, to the class of deliberate transgressors, and is not regarded as being inadvertent. Rambam is explicitly referring to here people who claim, say you didn't know that a certain thing was illegal, right? Let's say on Shabbat, you didn't know that you're not supposed to, I don't know, fill in the blank. You're not supposed to, cook your whatever your piece of food on Shabbat, right? So it's one thing if you're just an average Joe and what do you know? You don't know. You missed that day in Hebrew school, so you never learned and finished, right? But if you're a rabbi who people come to for religious decisions and you teach the laws of Shabbat and you didn't know, well, then there's no excuse anymore, right? So that person is not regarded as being inadvertent. Therefore, a rebellious elder is killed, like we said before, even though he has acted and given decisions on the point of law in accordance with the doctrine established by his own efforts, right? The great court of law, the Sanhedrin themselves, have the right to establish a doctrine by their own effort. They can do that. Accordingly, if they are mistaken, so let's say the great court of law should make a decision and then realize later that we've made a mistake, right? So the Torah says that they bring a special atonement and everything, right? But we don't kill them, right? Because they had the right to make those decisions, right? So as he may be exalted says, and if the whole congregation of Israel shall err, and so on. The whole congregation referring to the high court representing everyone. Because of this fundamental principle, the sages, may their memory be blessed, say, an inadvertent mistake in doctrine is considered as a deliberate transgression, right? If you make a mistake in the Torah, right, when you're responsible to teach and know the Torah, meaning that one who, while being deficient in doctrine, gives decisions on the point of law and acts in accordance with this deficiency, is regarded as a deliberate transgressor. Why? For the status of one who eats a piece of fat from the kidneys, thinking that it is fat from the rump, right? Let's say I gave you a piece of fat, right? from the kidneys, which is one of the forbidden fats to eat, right? And you think that it is fat from the behind of the animal, which is not forbidden to eat, right? So it just looks like a piece of fat, and it looks nice and juicy, and you eat it, right? Um, so that person, right, his inadvertent transgression is not the same as someone who eats fat from the kidneys, knowing what it is, but without knowing that it is one of the forbidden fats, right? Let's say I tell you this is fat from the kidneys, and you know exactly what it is, but you don't know. Now, so there your deficiency is in knowledge of the law, right? So if you're a teacher, right, for the latter, though he may offer atoning sacrifices, close to being a deliberate transgressor, because you should have known the law, right? Right? You have less of an excuse, right? And he is this merely by acting in this manner. But one who gives decisions on points of the law in accordance with his ignorance. But if you're touting yourself as a teacher and a rabbi, and you're issuing decisions in public about this, that is indubitably a deliberate transgressor. For the text of the law excuses a mistaken decision on a point of the law in the case of the great court of law only. The only people that are allowed to make such mistakes and not be considered deliberate is the Sanhedrin themselves. Okay, so we've discussed someone who is a forced transgressor, as was that the term we used? No, compelled, meaning in total ones. And we discussed someone who's a shogeg, and we discussed someone who is we're about to discuss someone who's deliberate, right? We're edging towards deliberate. So amazed, someone who deliberately does something. As for the deliberate transgressor, he must undergo the punishment prescribed by the text. That's the person who gets the punishment for the sin as the Torah prescribes it. Remember, we mentioned before death and lashes and karet, getting cut off, namely either by death, a quarter of a law, or blows, or for insubordination in the case of transgression is not punishment by flogging, or a fine in some cases. As for those transgressions in the case which inadvertence and deliberation are considered to have an equal status, this is done. In what cases do in certain cases we consider a shogeg equal to a mazid? In other words, we consider inadvertence similar to the same level as someone who's deliberate. That's because they occur often and with ease, being committed by means of words and not of deeds. So, for example, the oath considering testimony and the oath concerning deposit. People who swear falsely about if a person knows witness about something, right, and refuses to bear witness, and the person who wants them to come to court to testify on their behalf makes them swear, the Torah says he can force them to make an oath. It's so common for people to say, "Oh, I don't know anything," and then swear because it's just words. It's so easy to get out of saying something they don't want to say, right? So they try to escape. So they can't go ahead and say, "Oh, I didn't know that this was such a terrible thing to make such an oath. I didn't realize how bad it was," and they consider themselves to be inadvertent. So similarly, sexual intercourse with a bondmaid that is betrothed to a man. This is a situation where a woman is not is betrothed to a man, but she can't get married. It's a complex situation. She's like half slave and half free. So people treat her. Remember, we're talking in the times when a woman without a male protecting her, so to speak, was more commonly abused, right? And this woman can't be married, so therefore she's people take their liberties with her way more often than they should. So because it's so simple to do, you can't get away with saying, "I didn't know." So the punishment is stronger, or it's equivalent to the shogeg is equivalent to the mazid. Is regarded as a light matter because it occurs often, as much as she abandons herself because of her being neither completely a slave nor completely free, nor does she belong completely to a husband, as tradition has it when explaining this commandment. So he doesn't go into too much detail, but because people are open and free with her, and therefore the Torah considers a shogeg equal to a mazid. So then he goes on to the fourth category, which is not going to complete. I don't know if I'll be able to finish this chapter tonight, but I'm going to try. It's him who transgresses in a high-handed manner. So he is a deliberate transgressor who acts with impudence and audacity and makes his transgression known in public. Accordingly, such a one does not transgress merely because of desire, or because on account of his evil character he wishes to obtain things that are forbidden, So it's not just, he fell to temptation, or, he really, really, really thought that, the pepperoni pizza just looked too delicious to pass up on. Or, he really wanted the guy's fancy car, so he stole it. It was something, but this guy is not just that, right? But rather, this is a person did it in order to oppose and combat the Torah. Therefore, it says of him, he reviles the Lord. He must indubitably be killed. That's why the punishment for him is death. Whoever acts in this manner does so only because of an opinion formed by him, in virtue of which he is opposed to the Torah. Because of this, the traditional interpretation states the scripture speaks about idolatry. This kind of person is almost by definition, or is by definition, according to Chazal, as this is idolatry. For the latter is the opinion opposed to the foundation of the Torah. This person is opposed to the entire foundation of the Torah, and is against everything the Torah is trying to establish our community to be. For a star cannot ever be worshipped except by one who believes that it is eternal, a parte ante, right? Idolatry, if you're going to worship a star, that means you think that that star is eternal. You think that that star is not a created being, right? But the Torah says that no, the star was created. Everything in the universe was created, right? So basically, you're undermining the fundamental of the Torah, as we've explained several times in our compilations. To my mind, the same applies in the case of every transgression in which the wish to ruin and oppose the law manifests itself. To my mind, if an individual belonging to Israel would eat meat with milk, or wear shatnez and mingled stuff, or round the corners of his head because he holds these prescriptions in slight esteem, in view of an opinion of his that makes it evident that he does not believe in the truth of this legislation. In other words, he decided that I'm going to do this because I don't care about this law. I think this law is ridiculous, right? So I'm going to do it. So that person is on the same level. He would, in my opinion, revile the Lord and ought to be put to death as an infidel, and not in order to punish him for his transgression. Not because the transgression is so bad. Just like the Rambam said, when a person who eats a ham sandwich, nothing terrible has happened. People eat ham sandwiches every day, and the world doesn't come to an end, right? But the point is this guy says, I'm not going to keep this law because it's ridiculous, because then you're fundamentally undermining the Torah. Just as the inhabitants of a town led astray are put to death as infidels, and when we had the law that the Torah talks about, a ir hanidachat, that's a city where the entire city decided to worship another god and not to worship God, right? They're put to death not to punish them for their transgressions, right? But they're put to death because of their undermining the entire fundamentals of the Torah, as in the case of the other sentenced to death by a court of law. I shall say the same about every community of Israelites who decide unanimously to transgress any commandment, whatever, and act high-handedly. All of them shall be put to death. You may know this from the story of the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad, about whom it says, and the whole congregation decided to go to war against them. Then it was made clear to them in the warning that they had committed an act of infidelity through agreeing unanimously to perpetrate this transgression, and thereby apostatized from religion as a whole. That was the idol of Micah in the book of Judges, that story. This is the meaning what they said to them to turn away this day from following the Lord. They, on the other hand, implied, if it be in rebellion and so on, grasp these principles also with regard to penalties. That's why the penalties of those transgressions are so severe. So on the topic of the book of Judges, he continues in the book of Judges. Let me just stop for a quick second in case anyone has any comments or thoughts so far. I said I was going to go through this quickly, but I'll try to slow down a little bit. If there aren't any, then I'll keep going. But I do want to make one comment. When the Rambam said before about Sanhedrin having the ability to abolish laws when historical circumstances might necessitate that. Many of you may know that I'm personally a vegan, right? And so people ask me all the time about what's going to be with the sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash. Right? That's obviously not a very vegan practice, right? So I don't really have a great answer. So I'm not going to give you any great wonderful words of wisdom right now. But I will tell you that Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, who was one of the great leaders of the rabbinic leaders of the earliest 20th century. Yosef before mentioned the idea of trying to get around the Shemitah, the seventh year in Israel when they're establishing a new state, and every seventh year not farming would have been devastating to the new economy. So Rav Kook was famous for many things, but among them was figuring a way to get around that, which we could talk about another time. But he was one of the greatest rabbinic leaders of that generation, and he himself held that, and he writes this in many places, that in the future time there will be no need for humans to eat animals or use animals for work anymore, and that there will be no more consumption of animals. And Rav Kook himself was almost a vegan. It's said that he didn't eat any animal products except for one piece of chicken on Friday night, and that was it. Now, why he did that, he never really explained it in any of his writings, but that was his own personal practice. But anyway, he writes about the future time in the Beis Hamikdash, which we were talking before about when if you carried the logic of the Rambam, the way he explains the reason of the sacrifices to its logical conclusion, then one would say that, well, in the time that we needed to have sacrifices, because remember, that's how people then related to God, that's how they worship, then one day we shouldn't need it anymore, right? So Rav Kook suggests that in the future times, what the future times means, it's a little complex, that there will be no animal sacrifices in the third temple. And Rav Kook tries to find several ways to explain how halachically that can happen when it seems to fly in the face of so much of halachic literature. I mean, it's certainly not the simple understanding of halacha. So one of the methods by which Rav Kook says we may be able to not have animal sacrifices is, Rav Kook explains using the Rambam that we studied together tonight. Rav Kook says that Sanhedrin will hopefully be reestablished one day. A body of, will then be able to declare that in a time when the bringing of animal sacrifices would be more harmful to the glory of God than otherwise, which Rav Kook argues would be true in modern times, right? Because nowadays, the vast majority of the people in the world would find such a practice to be, how should I say, abhorrent at worst, or at best, very out of touch with the times, right? So Rav Kook says that Sanhedrin would have the ability to, in that time, under the circumstances, in other words, the circumstances of the times we live in today, right, abolish that mitzvah. But there is no Sanhedrin to do this today. But that Rav Kook writes this explicitly, and uses that as his explanation for how there won't be sacrifices in the third temple. He has several other approaches too, but he devotes the most time to describing that path. I know this might come as a shocker to some people, but he does write it, and I could find, if people want me to send them the reference, I can, but because I somewhere in my house I have it, but anyway, I just thought you guys might find that interesting. I'm not trying to advocate pro or con. I'm telling you what Rav Kook wrote. It's his name. This is not my thinking. This is his thinking. If you don't like it, you can direct all problems to him, not me. All right. So so here we go on with the Book of Judges. I don't know if anyone. Okay, so the Book of Judges includes also the commandment to destroy the seed of Amalek. So here we have another problem, and I don't think we're going to have really a lot of time to do this. We're just going to have to continue this next time because we're running out of time on the clock. But Amalek is the nation which we are required to destroy, right? And how is it that we're required to destroy a nation? The Rambam will deal with that a little bit in next week's lecture. Let me open the floor for questions, comments on today. Sorry I couldn't finish chapter 41, but I warned you it might happen. So it's a long one.
I just have a quick question.
Mhm.
As you know, about 20 years ago, they did establish sort of a Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Steinsaltz was involved in that
Right.
over the objection of his son. Could you explain what happened to that Sanhedrin? Whatever happened to that one?
I don't. I'm familiar with it vaguely. Like I remember reading about it and people talking about it, but I don't really know specifically what happened. I can tell you that it for whatever reason it didn't become accepted.
Okay.
But in theory, it could have been done, right? In theory, if some, the problems are obvious, right? The schools of thought within Judaism today are so widely divergent one from the other that you know whatever body it would have to be representative of the entire Jewish people, right? It goes without saying that the Orthodox wouldn't consider someone who's not Orthodox to be representative of anything, right? So right away you just knocked out a large chunk of the Jewish people, right? So then among the Orthodox, this one thinks that that one's no good, and that one thinks that that one's no good. Nobody's religious enough for the next guy, right? So there's how many boards of rabbis and committees and associations have been formed, and then for every association there's a breakaway from that association, you know. So it's sad, I mean, I could laugh about it, but it's not funny, it's very sad, and it's sad that we can't sit together with people that we disagree with, I mean, since when was there what? And nowadays, they disagree with you, you call them all kinds of names, and and you don't respect their anything. I mean, it's the world we live in. I mean, it's the reality. But in theory, if there would to be a Sanhedrin, then there would be, you know, but it would have to be something that's accepted, not an organization that's widely accepted by the overwhelming majority of the diversity of the Jewish people around the entire world. So, which, like I said, is just not realistic today. I'm not pointing my finger at this one, that one, or that one, because there's plenty of fault to go around. But it's a shame because the structure of the Torah, this is what the Rambam was telling us tonight. And we have to remember this. The Torah was structured in such a way that Sanhedrin should exist in order to help us navigate through the time. In other words, the Torah was built with a system of amendments, right? It's a constitution, but it told us how to make amendments, right? But we can't do that part. So we have our hands tied. So we're not living a halachic system the way the halachic system was meant to be, right? We're living a halachic system today that has no ability to make these kinds of enactments and changes. Remember, when I say change, I mean the kind of change that the Rambam said, not a change in the sense that I uproot what the Torah said, but a change in the sense that we determine certain times, that certain things need to be done or not done in certain ways. But regardless, I mean, we're and just think about that. I mean, think about the fact that when we say we keep halacha today, we're 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 doing what we can with what we have, but we're not doing it according to the system the way it was designed. You know, so when we get frustrated about certain things, when we argue about whether or not we should, does it make sense anymore to keep 2 days, of a holiday, or does it make sense anymore to have this decree or that decree, or does it make sense? If there was a Sanhedrin, then they would be able to debate those questions and make a decision that would be binding across the Jewish people. But we don't have a Sanhedrin to do that. So our arguments make a lot of sense, but we have no committee to appeal to. We're stuck. The other famous attempt at making it historically was Napoleon's Sanhedrin. You know, Napoleon made a Sanhedrin. It was led by Rabbi, I think his name was Rabbi David Ginsheim, a very famous Talmudic scholar, a tremendous Talmudic scholar. He was a really, I think he wrote commentaries on Talmud. I think it's called Nachlat David or something like that. But a very, very, really big time, one of the leading rabbis at the time was the head. But again, it was only in the Napoleonic empire, which only his plate. It didn't represent all of Jewry. But that was another famous attempt. But there were others, and Rabbi Steinsaltz's attempt a couple decades ago was a famous one. In theory, it would be great, but it ain't happening anytime soon. Don't bank on it. Any other comments? All right, well, we'll continue with chapter 41. The later chapters, some of them get a little shorter as we rumble through this making sense of the Torah, and as we hurtle towards the end of this monumental achievement of ours, completing the book. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining.
Yes, Shukra.
All right.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you.
Yes, well,
Thank you.